Alrighty, there we go. Well, welcome everyone. Okay. Good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's great to see everyone here for our very first webinar of our three-part webinar series, The Politics of Power. I am pleased to be your MC today. So for a little bit of background on Newcastle, Newcastle is home to Australia's only CFAL centre, hosted by the University of Newcastle in New South Wales on Australia's east coast. CFAL Newcastle focuses on sustainable development, global health and well-being, climate adaptation, and equity and Indigenous knowledge, with particular interest in the Pacific region. Newcastle is famous for its harbour, beaches, and natural beauty, offering a relaxed lifestyle and access to the famous Hunter Valley region. Newcastle is also home to the world's largest coal port, with year-to-date exports reaching 34 million tonnes. Current data says Australia itself uses coal for 45% of its energy source, while renewables make up 36% of energy sources, with New South Wales using coal for 1/3 of their primary energy source. In the 2024 financial year, export revenue from coal was worth $91 billion, employing over 50,000 people. However, Australia is targeting 82% of electricity generated by renewables by 2030. This is a key part of our webinar today. As one of the largest coal exporters in the world, how can Newcastle make the renewable energy transition? Multiple factors need to be considered, from political decision-making to renewable energy capabilities. Newcastle is asking the question, can we move from a coal giant to a clean energy powerhouse? So for online housekeeping, this webinar has been advertised across 2 different time zones specifically. For some, it will be 9 a.m. and for others, it's 6 p.m. Others may be coming from time zones beyond that. We will be moving forward on the host time, which this week is Newcastle, so it is 6 p.m. Any references to time will be as such, if there are references. For this webinar, we have a Q&A feature at the end to close out our session. You can submit questions at any point. We will do our best to answer all the questions, but if too many come through, we'll only be able to answer as many as the time allows. We do have a chat monitor as well, who will be monitoring communications to ensure everyone is safe and happy. The expected end time for this session is 7:30, inclusive of the Q&A, and then we will have a post-webinar feedback survey available. For those who have attended all 3 webinars, a CFAL certificate of participation will be emailed to your registered address. But you must attend all 3 webinars and must comment at the end of each webinar to be considered. Otherwise, it just becomes a technical nightmare. To introduce today's lineup, we have Dr. Brodie Beals, Dr. Paul Ebert, and Laura Eadie. Brodie is CFAL Newcastle's director with a career in institutional strategy and an academic background in philosophy. Brodie is working to integrate sustainability into how we think and how we learn. Paul is a recognized expert in energy systems and infrastructure, contributing to forward-looking solutions for sustainable industry transformation. Laura is a respected leader in sustainability and regional development with extensive experience driving strategic energy transition initiatives. I would like to start by introducing the wonderful Dr. Brodie Beals. I will get your thing up.
Thank you.
You are so welcome.
First of all, it is extremely exciting to be here. I can't believe that this whole webinar has grown out of a conversation that we had on a train, and I'm super happy to see you, Mustafa, online. You are the man that must not be lost. And indeed, we have continued not to lose you. Are we good to share?
I believe so. Now we're good to share. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background about coal and how we got here. So like so many things in life, Newcastle, as we know it today, is the product of geology and a series of accidents. First mention of coal is in 1791 by escaped convicts fleeing in an open boat from Port Jackson. Coal was reported again in 1796 when some fishermen took shelter from a storm and noticed the gleaming black bands visible in the cliffs around the river. And in 1797, Lieutenant John Shortland was pursuing yet more escaped prisoners. And yes, there absolutely is a theme here. and made the first formal record of coal in this location, which went on to be verified, which meant sent to London. And in 1799, the first shipment of Newcastle coal set sail from our beaches to Bengal. It is interesting to note at this point that the people of the Awabakal Nation, that is the Aboriginal people of the Newcastle area, understood coal, they called Nikin, and the dreaming around it harks back to a time when darkness covered the earth, thanks to volcanic eruptions. In the Awabakal dreaming, the people met together and decided that they needed to rid the land of the darkness so daylight could return. So they buried the darkness underneath the earth, walking over it, pressing it down, keeping it underground. Presumably, they were perplexed as to why the colonists were so insistent on digging it all back up, as they knew that coal was the darkness that had to be kept buried to avoid a great fire. And so it seems it's absolutely no fault of theirs that we are where we are now, on the brink of catastrophe, thanks to a world on fire. Finding coal was one thing, and using it was completely something else. It was of no use to the colonists in the ground, but getting it out was dirty and hard, and it was dangerous. So they used what they had, and what they had was convicts. The coal was collected by convict labourers, digging haphazardly into the cliffs of the foreshore following the seams. A settlement was organised purely to house the convicts and the military unit responsible for making sure they worked. And settlement's hardly the word. It was just a few timber shacks for the overseers and tents for everyone else. But it persisted as the seams appeared to stretch out from the shore back up the river that, yes, you guessed it, somebody had used all the creativity to name the Coal River, into the Hunter Valley, one of the highest quality coal deposits in the world. But the colony was young and a long way from its source of labour. Workers were hard to come by, and due to a lack of any sort of skill or experience with mining, the workforce was, shall we say, fragile and prone to accidents. Convicts were given picks and told to get at it, hacking away at the exposed seams in a cliff face and in shallow shafts. However, because no one had any knowledge of mining engineering, nobody knew anything about draining or reinforcement or design, injuries and casualties mounted to the point at which the incoming commandant of the Newcastle settlement in 1804 stopped anyone at all working in the mine until they were supervised by somebody that actually knew what they were doing. It was too bad, even for convicts. Suddenly, skills that were commonplace in the mid-north of England were gold dust. But until 1823, Newcastle was little more than a shanty town come jail. In 1823, the big report was published, and that changed everything. It identified coal as a way to build wealth and improve conditions in the colony of New South Wales. And in 1830, the government worked out there was money to be made in this seemingly abundant supply of flammable black rocks and began to get serious. They formalized a company and began regulation. They hired a mine manager, a Mr. Henderson, who came to Newcastle in 1827, and the mines transitioned away from convict labour when they worked out that the real money was to be made in industrial scale production. And to do that, you had to have people who knew what they were doing. Industrial vision and a thirst for wealth saw the opening of new pits with real miners and experienced engineers and exploring further and further up the valley that necessitated the building of a railway system and a proper wharf to move and export the coal. Over the next 100 years, they invested in actual buildings and people who weren't convicts. And people who weren't convicts or members of the army came here to work the mines. The new city of Newcastle had a port and it had a railway, Bigger things were on their way. Holes were drilled and fortunes were made. Yes, it cost money to mine, but as the colony grew, so did the workforce. And the reliable source of taxation income from Newcastle's black gold financed many grand buildings in Sydney, and together with income from wool, cattle, and grain, kept the economy afloat through Federation, the Depression, and 2 world wars. Building a steel mill here in the early 1910s was just common sense. I mean, that's where the coal was. A suitable workforce lived here, and it's where the infrastructure existed. Building it anywhere else would have been crazy. With the miners came history, and I think both Laura and Paul are going to touch on this later. History of where they came from and the thoughts and beliefs they carried with them. Our suburbs are called things like Cardiff, Wallsend, Hamilton, and Lambton, having sprung up as little settlements around new pits, named by homesick families or self-aggrandizing leaseholders. Coal was the gift that just kept keeping on giving. Dig anywhere and you'd find it. The city itself is undermined literally with shafts, covered over and forgotten until the corner of a house starts sinking or a child gets stuck. There is even a mascot for mine subsidence. Maury the Mole, the New South Wales Subsidence Board's #1 weapon against children falling into holes. Maury's work continues to this day, and his motto remains the rather ominous "don't play in holes." Even children's universes were formed around coal mining. They went to schools named after their forebears. They lived in suburbs named after the old country their ancestors had left. And they played in a landscape pockmarked with pits and hidden danger. In Newcastle, everything speaks of how we got here. Our suburbs, our hills and lakes, brackets, this is landscape speak for tailings and disused pits. Our railway and our wharf are all tangible legacies of the colonial hunger for the darkness and what lies beneath. Newcastle has gone from being a frontier town where you could literally just dig a hole, stick the coal on the ship and pocket the profit, to a city that grew up as an epiphyte around the mines. It mirrored the people who were mirroring their forebears. Our city's form is a direct result of its function. We imported a way of being at the same time as we imported workers. And this way of being was only changed as circumstances required. We grew to become an imitation of that mining powerhouse that is South Wales, truly living up to our state's name, a strange new South Wales, subtropical and with sunshine. With the advent of the BHP steelworks, we transitioned to a bronze boom town. We were Manchester in the sun. Unemployment disappeared. There really was a job for everyone, and the resulting Newcastle steel, made possible by Newcastle coal, built Australia, literally and metaphorically. But the steelworks came to an end with the century, and while some industry remains and the port is looking to diversify, mining has long stayed with the Newcastle people as a significant employer. In the financial year of 23-24, the Australian government pocketed $59.4 billion from mining and associated industries. Industries that remain, in the eyes of many, undertaxed in relation to the amount of support they receive from federal and state government. Australia's geological wealth has long supported its standard of living and national growth. It's been an easy, reliable source of income. People need power. They want the lights to stay on, and there's no steel without coal. So if you drive a car, build a building, or do almost anything today, you are using something made possible by coal. And for that, you need us, the world's largest coal port. So the idea of suddenly repudiating coal chafes in Newcastle. This is a city that is built on, with, and by coal. To abandon coal, which many will acknowledge is something we need to do, on occasion seems a push too far. Coal is what built us. Coal is why we are here. It is why we are where we are. And it is also, to some extent, who we are. Who are we now without coal? This is both a personal and a community question, and both of these things are political entities. We are a staunchly unionist, left-wing, card-holding, Labour voting town, but we are also largely socially conservative, yet turned out the biggest yes vote outside a capital city in the same-sex marriage census. We live with our contradictions, like most people's towns, cities, and countries, in a world of our forebears' making. And as the following talks will explore, what does the new Newcastle look like? We're a pragmatic people, shaped by generations of mining families. We care about jobs. We care about our families and our way of life. We want jobs for our children. We want a stable future. And if we're going to be totally honest, we want not too much to change, really. But everything is changing. So how does a deeply pragmatic community adapt? If not coal, then what next? And it is now my absolute pleasure to hand over to Dr. Paul Ebert, Executive Director of the Newcastle Institute for Energy and Resources. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Brodie, and we'll just wait on Isabella to get the slide pack up. It's hard to know where to go from there. That was such a great introduction. But what I'm going to try and do is paint a picture of the economy in the region here. We call it the Hunter region. I'll explain what that region looks like so you've got a feel. In fact, you can go to the first slide. Let's start there. So for everyone on the call, very nice to meet you. I guess. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Let's frame what we call the Hunter region. And here's the big island of Australia. It's a massive place. Newcastle is the city that you've been seeing photographs of, and that's the red dot on the eastern side of the country. And there's a little yellow marker there. If you just hit the return or just hit one more space, Isabella. Yep. So that little yellow line on the left-hand diagram, if you expand that out, you end up with the diagram on the right, and the area enclosed in that red line, go back one, is what we call the Hunter region. Just to put it in perspective in terms of economy, so that area produces the largest regional economic gross regional product. So it's over 100 billion Australian dollars a year is produced from that region per year. And I want to give you a feel for where that comes from. So if you just go to the next slide. There's a number of natural assets in the Hunter region. It was formed essentially through millennia of the Hunter River flowing through that region. That Hunter River exits at the port of Newcastle, and that's shown on the left-hand diagram there. And really that river has set up the Hunter region pretty much for economic growth that we've seen historically. Not only is it one of the only deep water ports on the east coast of the country, Sydney has one. You have to go all the way up the coast to Brisbane, which is about 1,000 kilometres north of where we are to get the next one. And that deep water port is very important from a trade perspective. But that river has also brought water, which has been very important for agriculture. It's a region that has a lot of viticulture, so wineries. Curiously, it has one of Australia's premier thoroughbred horsing studs, and multiple studs. So it's a horse region. It has a lot of really beautiful natural wilderness. I think Brodie mentioned milk production, and livestock, and it's also known for its tourism. So they're kind of natural assets that have come essentially through that river flowing for so long. If you just go to the next slide, that river has also produced a lot of coal, and it's some of the best high calorific, low sulfur coal in the world, and that's very important has been very important for the world. And with that has come an industrial heritage that Brodie mentioned quite eloquently. Coal loading and export. There's a photograph there from the 1870s. I find that quite interesting to see those old ships in the port. Both open cut and underground mining, as Brodie said. The city of Newcastle is riddled with hundreds of shafts underneath it as a consequence of that. And now the largest coal export port in the world. And that's both thermal and coking coal. And it's important that you differentiate. So thermal coal is used for electricity generation and coking coal is used for the production of steel. So coal has been the bedrock of the economy, and out of that has come a number of things. So if you go to the next slide. Thanks, Isabella. There's an industrial heritage that has grown up around coal. So steel production has been mentioned already, but also electricity production. So a big component of Australia's electricity generation fleet has been based in this part of the world. You can see one of the power stations there in the middle, but also the downstream uses of electricity. So aluminium production has been very important for this region. And with that have come a whole bunch of other ancillary industries like mining equipment, locomotive engineering, steel products and manufacturing, and specialist steels like stainless steels, etc., and general heavy engineering. All of those things have come out of a consequence of that industrial base growing. So while we talk about coal, it's also the ancillary and downstream products of coal that actually make up the economy here. Next slide, thanks. But the industry, the Hunter itself, its industry is definitely in transition for a whole range of reasons. We tend to centre on the transition due to climate, and that is definitely a driver, but there are other reasons. The lower cost labour in other parts of the world, energy security, social cohesion, political changes that are going on in the world. All of these things are driving changes in industry, particularly energy-related industry. So on the left-hand side at the top there, primary steel making stopped just before the turn of the last century in 1999 with the closure of the largest steelworks here. There has been some loss of aluminium production. There's still aluminium produced here. In fact, the largest aluminium smelter in Australia is based in the Hunter region. And we're seeing a transition out of thermal coal generation. So that's one of the power stations, which I think it's next week, those chimneys will be coming, those stacks will be coming down. So we are seeing closure, and most of the thermal generation in this part of the world is going to be closing in the next 5 to 10 years. What's replacing that is quite interesting. Use of natural gas. So we're seeing that used more. Just stay back on that slide. Thanks, Isabella. And we're seeing some of the new technologies, new energy technologies come into the region. And what they're riding on is the infrastructure that's been built up around coal and thermal power generation. So energy storage, we're seeing much more investment in the renewable energy world. And those ancillary engineering capabilities are starting to translate into really diverse, bespoke type industries. So The Hunter region's now producing technology which goes into defence. And for example, in that photograph from the bottom right, I believe the electrical systems are built in the Hunter region. So, that base that was built up on coal has started to transition and starting to diversify. So next slide, thanks. And what we're starting to see is the emergence of new industry. So while the electricity industry has been the first to transition, all of the downstream industries of energy are just starting to show impact of change and impact of transition. Now, what's important are those kind of things along the top there. With all this industrial base also comes a whole range of skills, important technical, manual skills. There's a workforce, and that's very important for the future. I mentioned infrastructure. The industrial infrastructure that is built up in the Hunter region is really important, and it's very valuable, and you don't easily replace it. There's also an industrial culture, and that can be commercial culture. It can be the way you organise and build things, the way you operate large industrial plant. And as I mentioned before, niche manufacturing. So this manufacturing capability is still there. It's at smaller scale, it's niche, but it's still there and is pivoting to new technologies. Some of the new industries we're starting to see are kind of in the value chains, the downstream value chains of energy. So the hydrogen value chains, for example, the use of carbon products, and a really interesting one, circularity and the use of waste. So there are some used solar panels shown there on the right-hand side, and those sort of circular, what we call urban mining technologies and innovation are starting to translate into potential new industries of the future. And this is just a small sample. So if you think about using those skills, infrastructure, culture, and manufacturing capability along the top there, out of that comes some really interesting new opportunities. So there's a colour on what's happening in the Hunter, how it's transitioning. Now, just a comment before I hand on to Laura. One thing I am very aware of is that such a transition doesn't come easy, and Brodie talked about the fact that we kind of like things to stay the way they are. If we do that, we will become victims of transition, I suspect, because this will roll over us as a community. So to have this emergence, to be winners in this new future in this industry, you have to actually want it. So part of the dialogue and the narrative in this community is actually, well, do we want that? And what will it look like? Will it be compelling? So with that, I'm going to hand on to Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Oh, do you mind if we just go back one? And you'll see Paul's institute email down the bottom. So Paul, I'm just going to do a shout out. If anyone has questions or wants to follow up, please email at that address. I just wanted to say a few things before I get into my slides. So thanks, Brodie and Paul, for Brodie, the excellent introduction, Paul, that context. Brodie, you gave us a great historical overview. I just want to touch briefly on how, from my perspective, resources and weather have shaped the industry and the culture here. So turning to coal, it once was, but no longer is our largest employer, but it's still the highest paying. So Paul's point about people having to want a new future and being able to see themselves in that future does have a bit of a barrier in that it's quite easy if you live in one of the coal regions here to go from school with very little qualification into a high-paying coal mining job, or at least it has been. The belief in that straight-through pipeline is starting to diminish and creating some issues for youth, which I'll touch on in a minute. I also wanted to just share a personal anecdote. I am, of all things, I'm learning the saxophone from a very good local trumpet player who has a Welsh background. So she comes from a long line of Welsh trumpet players, and she still coaches and supports a number of the town bands that have been an incredibly important part of the social fabric of the Hunter Valley, right from near Newcastle all the way up into the upper Hunter Valley. And so it's quite interesting to see that legacy lives on. Secondly, I said I'd mention weather. So the Hunter used to be a very large dairy producing region. It no longer is, although there's some remnants in a few parts of the upper Hunter. My institute's history actually comes from very significant floods in 1955 that disrupted the dairy industry to such an extent that the community and the industry got together and said, we need to diversify. We need to have enough knowledge at our fingertips to be able to choose how we push for the full economic and social development of the region. And I'll touch on weather again a little bit later in the presentation. So look, Brodie pointed out the extraordinary geology of the region, and from one perspective, it has been incredibly lucky. So as Paul mentioned, there's some of the highest quality thermal and coking coal in the world here. It's connected by a port through to the world's largest coal export terminal, and a port that isn't blocked by in the way that some of the other ports in Australia are. So we're actually very, very lucky from that perspective. And for many decades and longer, that geology has actually funded all the hospitals, schools, infrastructure of the region, and a standard of living that a lot of regional areas in Australia just can't match. But that geological fortune does have a bit of a shelf life. And what we're seeing now is that two of our three largest customers, so Japan and Korea, China being the third. So Japan and Korea are looking to legislate their way out of coal dependency with their net zero plans. And so understanding what that means and how fast that change might impact the Hunter shapes everything I want to say about what the Hunter does next. Can we move to the next slide? So I'm going to touch a little bit on the politics, which is not, it's not simple, but it does, I'm going to try to simplify it. So I'm going to talk about two different perspectives on the coal timeline. Now, this is about the coal mines. This is not about the power plants. The power plants are retiring because they're old and too expensive to run. This is about the coal mines that are still exporting around 98 million tonnes per annum, or $13 billion a year worth of exports across the Hunter and the Central Coast. And so what I'm showing on the screen here is two potential timelines for a reduction in those exports. So the solid line is based on the current approved timelines for those mines to operate. Now, it's not the amount of coal they could produce, it's how long they're currently approved to operate for. And interestingly, that lines up pretty much with one view in the community, which is that production must reduce by 50% by 2030 if New South Wales is going to achieve its net zero targets. So we have legislated net zero targets of net zero by 2050 with an interim target of 50% reduction by 2030. And some people really think that is what must happen and therefore will happen. Others hold a different view, and you see that dashed line there shows what the production could be if certain mine extensions that are currently in the pipeline are approved, and that would see, possibly a 50% reduction a decade later by 2040. And that mismatch in the community of what people think must happen versus people think might happen actually makes it really hard to do good planning and raises the risk of political polarisation. I would just want to comment again, I mentioned weather. There is actually, for those who are interested in international law, quite a few people are watching Australia at the moment because we're becoming the latest in a line of, a long line of countries where local or national courts are testing the proposition of responsibility of domestic production for international emissions. And so there's a case in front of the High Court at the moment that may actually collapse the dashed line back much closer to the solid line, based on whether the planning approvals adequately consider the local environmental impacts of coal that's exported and burnt overseas. I'm short on time, so I won't say much more on that, but I know that there's a number of international legal and science groups that have supported that case, and I'm following it very closely. But back to my point here with this polarization, to me, the question isn't whether to transition, it's actually how do we design a path that respects that people have different views on those time horizons and different risk appetites. How do we do that without losing social acceptance of the need for a transition? Mind if we pop to the next slide? So this slide starts to talk about some of those social impacts. And what you're looking at here is something that to me really draws out the intergenerational disconnect that we're starting to see in the areas that have heavy reliance on coal mining. The red line shows our youth unemployment across regional New South Wales. So you'll see it sort of hovers most of that period for the last 2.5 decades. It's hovered around the 10 to 15%. The blue line shows the Upper Hunter, which is our most coal intensive area. And on average, we've actually had lower youth unemployment than the rest of regional New South Wales, except for when you get an industry disruption. So Paul mentioned steel mines closing, BHP steel closing in the end of the decade. So that's the first spike you see there, up to 20% when the steel industry restructured. And then every time we've had an economic disruption, often related to coal, that youth unemployment pops up to 15 to 20%. So what we're really seeing is that often young people are the last hired in a boom and the first out in a decline. And that creates some real issues for social cohesion, as well as for retention of population in those regions. I just want to touch briefly then on the demand side. So Korea has committed to coal export exit by 2040. They're going heavily nuclear. Japan is hedging. They're relying on ammonia co-firing, which is more of a delay in their demand for coal rather than a direct reduction, but they overall do intend to reduce. China, as our second largest customer, is growing, but it's worth noting that they're not a particularly reliable customer. So in 2020, they imposed an unexpected ban on imports of coal from Australia, and that lasted for 3 years. So it was driven by geopolitical reasons rather than economic, but certainly had implications, as I think you can see there on the right-hand side of the chart. That China trade ban in 2020 drove up another increase in youth unemployment. And so what we're seeing is that Japan and Korea in particular are giving us a structural signal, and China's giving us volume now, but uncertainty for tomorrow. So these dips that you see, or in fact, sorry, they're spikes in youth unemployment, the way I've done the chart, they're actually not cyclical. They're a secular decline sitting on top of existing volatility. And so I guess the question for the region socially is if that's what it looks like when coal is still here and reasonably dominant in terms of paying high paid jobs, then what does it mean for young people and future generations if we do see that structural decline setting in towards 2050? And look, it's not an argument against coal. I think it's an argument for making sure we really think through what the future looks like for the next generation so that they're not exposed to a commodity cycle that we really can't control. And so that brings us to diversification. Can we go to the next slide? As Paul mentioned, we have a pretty diverse economy, but we also have some excellent skills in industrial project management, new product development, managing large, complex infrastructure. And they're things that we should be leveraging. But what I've observed in my time working on this issue is that the Hunters pattern, certainly from a government perspective, seems to be about picking the next big thing, placing a lot of bets on that, and then when each time that hits technical or economic hurdles, jumping and starting from scratch and picking the next thing. And so we saw that with offshore wind and ammonia being heavily pushed, ammonia and hydrogen being heavily pushed as the solution a couple of years ago. Offshore wind's not currently financially viable, so there's a bit of a going back to the drawing board and looking at what the next thing will be. And that's not really a strategy. It's sort of, I guess, placing sequential bets and hoping that you get it right in time. But as we've seen from our last slide, we don't have a lot of time. We're losing young people and potentially impacting their futures if we don't a bit smarter about this. When we look at the Ruhr Valley, that failed for a long time, but then succeeded when it actually started deepening existing industries rather than chasing new ones. And I think the Hunter's advantage is really the same. We've got heavy industrial capability we can build on, but I think we need to take a different approach. So think about this as you would if you were running a corporate, and actually have a portfolio management approach where you see on the left side of the screen we've got coal that's still going for at least another decade, maybe longer. Use that to build up our nearer term growth options, which could be ammonia and nitrates, could be clean fuels, and then also placing some bets on the longer term. So things like green hydrogen, aluminium and steel, which require a lot more technical development, but if they pay off and become commercially viable, could certainly be a very big contribution to the economy. So I just wanted to finish by saying that the transition isn't for us about finding the right answer once. It's about building the institutional capacity to keep making better bets. Thank you very much, Brady. I'll hand back to you. Oh, and sorry, my email on the bottom if you have questions or want to follow up on any of the slides.
Thank you so much, Laura. And also Paul, that was fantastic. We'll give everyone a slight moment to start getting their questions and ideas around this space together. You mentioned the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, and there's other places, Spain, for example, produced a large amount of coal and is now backed out of it completely. What lessons can we learn that are potentially directly applicable here, and what might need to be changed or altered or contextualized? Paul, I might go to you first to give Laura a break.
Sure. Let me kind of shoot from the hip on that one. I think the first lesson is it's possible. Now, I've seen lots of, I was based in the UK for many years, and I saw some communities very heavily impacted, and there was really quite poor planning around that. But there were others that were well planned, and I think kind of going back to what Laura was saying, I think there are steps you need to take to build up the value chains that replace the incumbents. This idea of using the incumbent industries to essentially bankroll the new industries, I think that's very important. You've got to have capital and economic growth to build the economy of the future. So there's some sort of shoot from the hip reactions. I see Laura nodding. What do you think, Laura?
I agree. I actually find the Ruhr really interesting because it's often held up as an example, and yet they almost got it wrong. So there were many years where there was a lot of union opposition to the changes, a lot of money spent and wasted, and it was really only through a lot of extra money being put in, plus some pretty significant state level economic planning, that they eventually got it right. It's also quite different from here that their coal was for domestic use. It was brown coal used domestically, whereas we are high quality black coal that's exported. So the politics are different here. And I think there is the potential for a dual track approach where we maintain that export while also building other industries. But it does require it requires people to see their futures as being possible in the new industries. And that's something I think can be quite challenging to get right. I hear a lot of people locally saying to me, you got to see it to be it. And that's certainly something we observe for the Upper Hunter, where young people are no longer seeing their future in coal. They're no longer seeing it in agriculture. So we're seeing numbers of job starters in those two industries declining, but they're open to new industries and open to renewables, but they don't really know what that looks like because they haven't met somebody who's had a career in those sectors yet. So I think there's a big issue around how do you take the current identity, cultural and social identity, and then link that through into new industries. And I don't know that we've quite got that right yet. There are a couple of other international case studies that are interesting and showing green shoots, pardon the pun, but they often haven't handled their Indigenous communities well. So when I look at the US in particular and parts of Canada, they either don't engage the Indigenous communities, so you have people being left behind, or they've managed to maintain coal production or oil production in one area of the state, and build their green industries in another. So we're quite unique in that we want to do the two together in the one location, which makes that social legitimacy and the belief in the future even more important.
Where do you think that the government, first of all, two questions. What role does the government play in planning this transition? And two, how do we establish ourselves as the natural place for this investment?
Do you want me to have a crack, Paul?
Go for it.
Okay, so I think what role the government does play is quite easy to answer, but what role it should play is the question I really want to answer. So look, we at the moment are fortunate to have both at our local, so state level or provincial for those who come from different countries, and our federal or national level, we have governments that understand the importance of the region and have a significant level of support for manufacturing. So transition without deindustrializing is currently, I guess, politically acceptable. And so that's great. There's money going in, there's investment in innovation, there's a consideration of how important it is to get it right in this region to show that it works for other regions around Australia. But we have also a long economic policy history now of rubbishing the idea of needing to support industries. So we've been very economically rationalist since the 1980s, and that needed to be done. The country was not operating effectively from an economic perspective, but there is, I think, a bit of a need for the government to shift that mindset and start to think really clearly about targeted support for industries that's linked to the stage of development of that industry. So if you go back to my last slide, development support or industry support for a legacy industry that's already making a lot of money would look very, very different from suitable support for something like green hydrogen. So that's what I really think they should be doing. And I guess that's part of a conversation that's underway, but probably really needs a mindset shift amongst many of the economic advisors that inform government policy. And then, sorry, Brady, the second part of your question was what they're doing, and then, you're
muted.
How should we? I'd actually, the second part of my question is much less interesting than where I think we should go on the back of what it is that you were talking about. What should, in your mind, the government be doing, and how much should they be putting behind it? And Paul, I think this question's going to apply equally to you. I think if the government doesn't take some kind of role here or create some kind of feasible plan, we run the risk of becoming a retirement village for Sydney.
Well, what happens is you have transition uncertainty and that leads to, doing nothing. So I want to step right back from the question, actually. And if you consider the history of the Australian political scene, unfortunately, energy has been a political football, and there's been no bipartisan energy policy in Australia for 40 years. Now, what I mean by that is energy has been used as a political tool, and very effectively, actually. If you sit on the commercial side of the investment cycle, what that political uncertainty raises is investment uncertainty. So we've had this on again, off again kind of transition policy, quite diametrically opposed. And unfortunately, it's starting to look like that's going to continue. So that just ripples through to uncertainty in the eyes of investors. And hence the money doesn't flow, and it makes it very hard to transition when you don't have any money. So it would be lovely to think that the political situation might actually align for the best interests of the country, because energy is so important to economy, to social cohesion, to all the things we hold dear. But I think transition at its heart is going to test capitalist democracies like Australia like never before. And we're going to see that play out, I think. To go more specifically to your question, there's no doubt there's a lot of political will in this part of the world. There's a lot of interest and narrative around reskilling and new economies. The problem is it's not translating, in my view, to fundamental industrial development. In many respects, the hunter has lost some of its skill sets. So it's kind of heavy engineering and manufacturing skill sets are starting to diminish. Manufacturing in general in Australia has mostly gone offshore. The current energy crisis that the world is in has exposed that somewhat. So today I was walking around an ammonia plant. It just reminded me how many products come out of a chemical industry like that, including CO2 for soft drink production, chemicals that are used for anaesthetic in surgery. Where do these come from, folk? Well, they come from the chemical industry. And if that industry is threatened, or the energy supply to it is threatened, it's a problem. So I think, again, I'm kind of waffling a bit, but policy direction is very important. Having that kind of, in these sort of transitions, having a North Star that everyone agrees with is actually where we're trying to get the economy to, is just so important, but it's missing. It's missing in action, and we're seeing this in lots of capitalist liberal democracies throughout the world. And hence, transition is really hard. It's hard, it's volatile, it's disorderly, and it's going to take much longer than people think as a result.
Does something need to happen to jolt people into an awareness of this? Do you think there's a great degree of complacency? As long as the lights stay on, people aren't too worried. Do you think something needs to happen in the broader populace for people to start pushing for this North Star?
I'm happy to have a go if you want to think about that one, Paul. So I'm going to comment a little bit on politics, because this is the politics of power, but I'm not going to limit it just to the very excellent point Paul made about energy being a political football, which has massively set back our transition, and it has also added costs to households that are unnecessary. But the thing I see consistently in politics over the last couple of decades is just the lack of vision. And so to answer your question very briefly, we are seeing an increasing number of people putting in a protest vote and voting for minority parties who probably will never have a hope of governing. I think the missing link is that message needs to be heard by the major parties to the point where they finally realize, oh, it's the vision thing that everybody's actually after. And then that is then translated into hopefully some level of bipartisan agreement around missions to put Australia at, back to where it has been in the past, which is actually a leading economy in terms of our industrial innovation. So it's pleasing that we have Labor governments at the moment that see that, but we don't at the moment have an opposition that thinks that way. So it's almost like I don't know what it is that will shift that view, and it's almost a matter of like drumming it through politicians' heads that they have to think longer term and vision, and then to have the confidence to actually explain that to the population and get people on board. The barrier that we have in Australia is an incredible per capita amount of resources. And we have always been, when you ask why have we been the lucky country, there's two reasons. You sit on that much resources per capita and you really can get by with digging it up and shipping it out for a very long time. So if we look Australia-wide now, it's not just coal, it's also iron ore, and we have huge amounts of gas as well. So there is a little bit of that Dutch disease issue where those industries dominate, and therefore you can be lazy with everything else and get away with it. And then the other reason, surprisingly, is that we've actually had very effective risk management amongst our bureaucrats, not always our politicians, but our bureaucrats. So I guess that's where I put my hope, that there will be enough work done at the bureaucratic level that we build the case for saying, actually, we need to invest in a mission-oriented way that gives confidence that there's going to be offtake, so that then the policy aligns behind and the politicians can say, okay, I'm happy to go out and talk about the vision because I know I'm backed up by some sensible policy and some good business cases. But to Paul's point, like that in itself takes ages to do because you've got to get economists to shift their perspective on industry support. So I don't know. I mean, pick any one of those threads and start pulling at it. That's what I'm trying to do. And I know that's what Paul's doing as well. Paul, keen on your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I had a really interesting discussion a few years back with a really well-respected climate scientist who was an advisor to President Biden in the US, when you could say the word climate in the US. And I asked him how frustrated he was, with the lack of action. Yeah, well, there was action, and we are responding as a world community to climate. There's no doubt, and we shouldn't forget we've done a lot, but we're nowhere near the level, at least the science is telling us is needed. And he said, he told me an interesting thing. He said, well, generally in the climate science area, we know that we're not acting fast enough. And the only thing that's going to change that is a seriously major climate event. And that was the thinking in that community, that, they've been saying this for 40, 50 years, actually. And the message just hasn't got...
a bit of that Chicken Little. We've been saying it.
A little bit.
And
when I said, what do you mean by a serious climate event? He said, well, if we kill 1 million people in one event, that sort of level, isn't that sad, really? It's kind of indictment on the human species, but at least from that perspective, kind of shocks. I mean, we're seeing a version of that play out right in front of us now. There's no doubt a lot of people are thinking about energy security as a result of what's going on in the Middle East. And those products don't just flow to the bowser and to your vehicle. They flow into the petrochemicals industries, the plastics, the pharmaceuticals, right through to food production, fertilizers. And it's just exposing the weaknesses that we have in the energy value chains. And I think, you get a combination of those, a more uncertain world, geopolitical tensions, and maybe people start thinking about, this kind of vision that Laura talks about becomes more important. How do we deal with that?
Ironically, perhaps Donald Trump may have done more for the transition than anyone else by declaring a.
Yep.
So we're starting to get questions, and everybody, please keep them coming.
Do you mind if I just do a quick build on Paul's point? Paul, I don't disagree, but I'd have to say we had a major catastrophic event with COVID.
Yeah.
A huge loss of life. Yet I would invite anyone who's on the call, put your hand up if you still wear a mask and carry hand sanitizer. So that is how short our collective memory is.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with you, though. I actually think mass migration due to climate disasters is what will shift things in Europe, I'm pretty sure. And I suspect once it reaches here, and we'll have to work through the ugly politics around migration that plays in Australia. But if we're getting every year thousands of people coming because Pacific Islands are just sinking, that's the kind of thing I see could shift. Anyway, Brodie, over to you for questions from the group.
Thank you. We've got one here from Udak Akpan. Experience in some regions in South Africa, which is similar to New South Wales in terms of having a local economy driven by coal, highlights several challenges in terms of managing the socio-economic impacts of this transition. How is New South Wales managing these social concerns, such as that potential loss of income, potential loss of job opportunities, reskilling, etc.? And I think this applies to what both of you were talking about. Who would like to jump in on that first?
We could open a big, deep, dark hole here.
Can I talk about the positive?
Yeah, go for it.
Maury the mole would just like to say, do not
don't
get
jump
in
that
any
hole.
holes.
So look, I'll just very quickly, in the main, we're not really, but the exception is on the reskilling. So there is significant government investment at the moment in more so in the vocational education, but a little bit in tertiary education, so universities, around centres of excellence for the kinds of technical skills that are going to be needed. So that's positive, but there's a bit of head in the sand when it comes to, like the chart I showed about youth unemployment. It tends to be wait until the crisis occurs and then throw band-aids or a structural adjustment package at a region.
Yeah, I'll just, one thing I mentioned in my opening bit about thermal coal generation is retiring. That's actually mostly about age of plant than responding to climate. But really, it's been a really fascinating journey, slightly different to the South African position I expect. And I've done a lot of work in South Africa over the years with Eskom and other companies there. What we've seen really dramatically here is the rise of rooftop solar. So small solar panels on households, and that is now the largest single generator, if you aggregate those in the Australian electricity market, which is a massive change from only 20 years ago. That's happened very quickly. I don't believe everyone has put solar panels on their houses because they believe in climate change. I think they're doing it because it's cheaper. So I'm very confident that even with the retirement of what looks like pretty cheap coal-fired generation, we're going to end up with a better economic outcome through that transition because the technologies have just gone down the cost curve so quickly. And we've got a lot of sun, like South Africa, lot of sun and a lot of wind. At the moment, we're seeing gas being the balancer, and as gas prices are volatile, so as they go up, we see that impact our electricity systems. But as we get more energy storage, we're starting to see the market de-link from that volatility. So this is a total experiment. We've got quite a complex electricity market. It's more complex than I believe the South African market is. But as I say, I'm quite confident that we're going to end up with a quite a good economic outcome, having de-linked from coal. And I can tell you, it was only a decade ago that lots of people were saying we weren't going to have that it was going to be a disaster. It hasn't been. I think there are different issues to South Africa here, but I think what I'm saying sort of overall is it is possible to actually have a good economic outcome. The question I think that's relevant here is, coal has essentially driven the economy here. In many ways, it's given us the standard of living that we have. How could you say to a country like South Africa or other countries that have got lots of coal that they can't do the same? The answer to that is the world has to provide the solutions that give them an alternative or give countries.
Thank you. There is a follow-up question also asked by Udak, which is, what is the political economy of the coal industry like? And how, and this is the vexed million-dollar question, how are vested interests integrated into the transition? And that is a diabolical question, Udak. Thank you so much.
Paul, do you want to go first, or do you want me to have a crack?
I'm happy for you to go first, actually.
All right. Look, I have worked for the state government, so I have seen firsthand some of the political influence, and it is not limited to the coal industry. Many industries in Australia that are powerful and long running wield incredible political influence. So at the moment, it would not surprise you to know that the local coal industry believes in that dashed line on my first slide, not in the solid line. And in fact, their view is the industry should continue to operate as long as they have reserves. And they do have a lot of reserves. There is a lot of coal still. And, we have mostly open cut mines. While they're more expensive to operate, it's technically feasible to go to underground and keep producing. And so that does create some politics that can make it quite difficult for governments to make decisions that are in line with their net zero commitments. So I will just leave that bit there. As to how interests are integrated, I think the comment I would make is that we do actually have some corporate responsibility amongst our coal mine operators. So I don't want to say that they all hold the view that coal should continue until the resources are exhausted. And there are certain players who are really trying to take leadership positions in terms of transition, community support, and skills and job support for moving into new industries. But it's not all of them. So I think the answer is we have to work with those who see the need for change for the best economic and social outcome for the region, while accepting that the broader politics will always be driven by, by that profit motive. And that's not something that companies should be embarrassed by, that I guess different organisations take different perspectives on what is the role of business. Just a final comment, though, is that, look, we have other industries. As Paul said, it's a very diverse economy, and many of those industries also wield political influence. And so you can certainly get some very interesting outcomes sometimes when there are differences of opinion between different industries around how landscapes should be managed and how development should continue. And I've certainly seen things shift politically when other industries speak up. I'll hand back to you on this. If you want to wade into that black hole.
I may leap in to save you here, Paul, because save your questions up for Udak, who is speaking next week. So
we can ask a curly question back.
Oh yeah,
excellent.
I will say one thing, Brody. I actually think what is at issue is actually the pace of transition. So in the coal industry, I think it's, well, what is your view of the pace of decline? I very rarely, it's been a long time since I've come up against a counterparty in the fossil fuel industry who doesn't believe we're in a transition. But the issue is often, well, how fast is that going to happen? That's actually the issue. And I actually think, going back to Laura's diagram with the dotted line and the solid line, I think those views are slowly coming together in time. So there was a time where that dotted line was just high forever.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting to see that it's coming down. And I think that's probably shareholder pressure, ultimately, more than anything. Responsible shareholding. We're going to see that fall back a bit with what's going on in the world at the moment. Everyone will retreat to just making money. But I think inexorably, transition is unstoppable. And it will ultimately be unstoppable because it will provide better value. And that's going back to my narrative about rooftop solar.
Yep.
I think once you get over that hump of value and the value proposition's better, it literally takes its own course. So there's some comment.
Thank you. We're just moving to our next question because they're mounting up here. So I may have to cut you off. It's from Abiodun Owolabi, who asks, can you walk us through a case study of an African coal mining firm as a typical example and discuss how coal has contributed to the local economy there and what lessons that holds for Newcastle? Paul, you've worked in Africa. Perhaps
but not in coal mining. Not in coal mining. So I've certainly worked with coal users. Yeah, I'm not close enough to give a sensible answer to that because I'm sure there are regional differences that matter. Perhaps that's a question for the next.
Yeah,
session.
I was just thinking we can save this one for UDAC. Coming for you.
UDAC, any lessons will be gratefully received.
Yes.
Yes.
Our next question's from Dr. Idinabo Ogolo. What is the biggest technical bottleneck to integrating the move to energy renewable reliability? Is that a storage issue?
Yeah,
that last bit was mine.
Can I just say, I don't think the biggest issue is technical. I think it's actually social, but I'll let Paul answer the technical piece.
Yeah. I was kind of getting out on that line, Laura. Look, the technical issues are pretty much resolving themselves. So, the problem you have with variable renewable input, of course, is there are times when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow. What happens initially is you find balancing plant, and I mentioned this before. In this market here, gas comes in to provide that balance because it can be turned on fast, it can be ramped up and down very fast, unlike thermal generation, which has problems with that. And the more renewables you get, not anecdotally, but actually in practice, the more gas you tend to get into a market. But like I said, at least in this market here, and we're seeing it in other markets throughout the world, energy storage is starting to take the role of gas. You throw in a couple of other interesting dynamics like electric vehicles. So not only are they bringing more load, but you can actually correlate your electric vehicle charging at periods when you've got lots of renewables. So in this part of the world, we've got so much solar on people's roofs that in a couple of months, we're actually going to be able to take electricity for free for 3 hours in the middle of the day, because there is so much energy in the market, and it's actually taking the wholesale energy cost to zero. So that's an example. Just to end though, the primary problem is not technical. It's actually becoming non-technical. So market construct is an example of that. Does your electricity market, does your energy market allow the products and services that these new technologies can bring to flourish? In the early days of battery energy storage here, it couldn't. You actually were breaking the law if you tried to use a battery in a certain way in our market. So the market has to develop as well, and there are all sorts of interesting products and services that can come out of that. I'm going to segue to Laura, because there's a very important thing about changing an electricity network and changing electricity generation fleet, in that you've actually got to go and build the physical assets of that. And that's where social license becomes very important. So Laura, over to you.
It all comes back to people.
It all comes back to people, it does. So there is no reason why we cannot technically shift to a much more flexible energy grid and reliant on the distributed energy, so the solar on the rooftops that Paul mentioned, backed up by a mix of pumped hydro and batteries. But there's two barriers to it. One is the speed of that transition is limited by people agreeing to have new transmission lines run across their land, and to have largely new wind turbines also located in areas where they can see it. And most of that's going into our regional areas, where people have very strong attachments to the landscape as it looks at the moment, and are not necessarily seeing the direct benefits for themselves and their communities. It's been framed as this is being pushed upon regional areas for the benefit of the cities, so that people can have power in the cities. So there's a social license and political issue there.
Is that a first world problem?
I don't know that it is.
Is it a petulance, like, oh, well, I just want to be able to look out my window, or is there something else behind
I
it?
think that trivializes it too much. Look, certainly there is NIMBYism, for sure. There's NIMBYism everywhere, but I actually think it goes deeper. I think if you have lived your life in a regional area, and particularly in an area such as the Hunter, that has provided most of the exports of New South Wales and significantly contributed to the state coffers, you then see new industries coming in that will result in, and I'm going to be frank, there will be, whether it's a short or long build cycle for the renewables, it's a cycle. So it's a surge in activity and then a drop back to very few jobs. And so you've got people who are very invested in the area, and they actually see that as, it's not just about the competing land use, it's about the land use that does not support the size of towns and support the kind of careers that other industries do. And then I think the second issue is that transition, whether fast or slow, it's going to be a little bit messy, and it is going to lead, given the way our electricity pricing market works, it is going to lead to higher prices at times, and those will be passed on to consumers. And no politician ever wants to see higher prices. It doesn't like, it's like the pain at the pump with petrol prices. It flows onto politics. And so to me, they're the two issues that make it socially difficult, even when it's technically quite feasible.
Speaking of socially difficult, we've got a couple of questions that have come in about, Nigeria has huge coal reserves.
Mm-hmm.
They're scattered across a number of provinces. How do we now, having exploited our coal reserves And we're now able to turn to, this is a classic post-colonial question, but it applies all over the world. And I think you touched on this earlier. What right do we have to say, yeah, no, that's great, that has to stay there?
The
And
simple, sorry.
hinges back, sorry, Paul, on that social license. It's not about the tech, it's all about the people.
The simple
You have a
answer,
right to do it. Sorry, Paul.
because the simple answer to that is the global north has to pay for it. That's the simple answer. Yep. Now, that's obviously incredibly complicated. Going back over the United Nations Conference of Parties over the last few years, this has been a big, big talking point. It's completely unfair for the global north to tell the global south they can't use their fossil fuel resources. Completely unfair. That's why they have to stump up with the money to make sure that that doesn't happen and actually provide, if needed, the technology and investment needed behind that. It's a very difficult thing to get right. And of course, what's happening, of course, is the global north aren't paying. So,
not enough, at least.
Not enough. Yeah.
How do we bring that pressure to bear, or is this genuinely the global north needs to sit down with its conscience and say, actually, we really should be doing
we're failing, Brodie. I think there's some hope in that some of the technologies are just simply they're the best commercial option we have, so it kind of naturally happens anyway. But this is a big, tough issue, and it's been a tough issue at the table for several years now. And I think it's incrementally improving, but it's very slow.
I mean, Paul, I think you're right. It does naturally happen as technologies come down the cost curve. But let's be frank, it's China that's done that. It's not the global north. The global north is thinking about how they then benefit from an economic competitive advantage point of view, not really thinking through the technology transfer to the south in a way that will allow for sustainable economic development there. So I do think there's massive failing. What we do about it, I mean, I'll go back to my comment before about mass migration due to climate disasters. I think that has potential to shift the tenor of discussion in privileged countries. What we do about it locally, I think sustainability does also have that slogan of think global, act local. So we have very disadvantaged, relative to our white population, we have disadvantaged Aboriginal communities. And so I'm quite passionate about making sure they're brought into the transition and benefit from that in a way that allows them to have economic sovereignty, and potentially even, going back to that great coal origin story, Brodie, that you outlined at the beginning, potentially that is our ethical underpinning. And so we need to draw on the incredible generosity of Aboriginal people in sharing those stories to say, okay, how do we shift the way we think about this locally and globally?
And I think we've got a final question that kind of unfortunately has to be our final question, that kind of sums it all up. How do we, and it's a question specifically about benefit sharing formula between regional government and the coal producing area and the national government. Is there any specific, and this is something you were hinting at earlier, Laura and Paul, that the government is putting some investment in here, but being as how we're also the people that have really benefited from having the coal, to what are we due, and how much is our problem to just shoulder ourselves? Sorry, that's an ethical question. Back up that last bit. To purely the practical element, is there a formula in place currently that you're aware of? Yes, there is.
There has been. There have been royalties for regions. So there have been programs that have seen the royalties collected by more so state than federal governments reinvested in infrastructure. And then Paul, you might be more across this than I am, but with the renewable energy transition, there are policy guidelines about community benefit sharing,
Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
they're working or not. I mean, there's a whole design question there.
Yeah, I mean
That wasn't the question, just
Okay.
that
And
wasn't
so
the
is your
question.
question, to what extent should the central government
no, what
be-
kind of things are currently in place?
So
Whether
there
or
is
not
a-
it should be different is a
Yeah.
rabbit hole that I'm
So look, I
that
think
Maury tells me we shouldn't go down.
there's a recently concluded royalties for region program. And so I think there would be, not that hard to start that up again. And there's an emerging, I guess, system around renewable energy proponents providing benefit sharing to communities. So there are things there. Whether or not they're enough and seen to be enough by the local communities is a different question. Paul, would you want to add
Look, I've been watching the chat, and there are lots of questions around fairness. And if this transition isn't fair, it's not going to happen. It's just going to stall. So all those questions around the use of coal and that, unless those communities are given options, the transition
I think
won't
governments, sorry, Paul, governments tend to want to make this a technology problem. They tend to want to be saying that, that we'll find a widget, we'll invest in and that was the thing that Laura was saying earlier. It's this serial monogamy of continual investments in just one next big thing. But eventually the problems are people. It's whether or not hearts and minds and concepts of fairness and equality and what is owed are going to be our Achilles heel, but also potentially the one thing that makes it fly.
Correct.
Yep. And I think it comes down to the intergenerational piece. So, if you're a 15-year-old living in Muswellbrook, looking around you and thinking, am I going to go into coal mining like my uncle and my dad? Am I going to go into agriculture like other members of my family? Actually, neither of those look too attractive. And houses now cost twice what they did only 10 years ago. Still cheap by Newcastle standards, but not but expensive by local standards. And your choice is curb your education aspirations to find a job that kind of works within that region versus leave. That is where the rubber hits the road politically.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you to all of the people that asked questions. And thank you all for coming along. Please tune in, same time, same channel on next Friday when we look at the case study of Nigeria, and we'll start saving up all those questions for you, Dot. Thank you. From all of us here in Newcastle, good evening, but I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank
you so
you.
much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. See ya.